Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming back to Regeneration Rising, the Design Science Studio event, where we're exploring resilience and coming together today on our 7th day of our 11-day event. And I am so grateful and honored to be able to welcome to the stage Richard Ramsey, who's been a longtime friend through the Trim Tab Book Club and through the World Weavers group that we run on Saturday mornings, Pacific time. And Richard has been a longtime member of those groups and very faithfully attending. And he comes with an amazing background. So Richard is a University of Calgary professor emeritus social work and president emeritus Living Works Education. He's been a longtime follower and applier of Bucky Fuller's geometric thinking in holistic models of social work and suicide safer living and social tensegrity applications in social systems. So welcome, Richard. We're looking forward to your talk. And maybe you can just introduce that talk to us as you get started here.
Just very briefly, and I'm really pleased to be part of this afternoon and be having time with David and in dialogue. And really, I think what we're going to do in our dialogue between ourselves and also with the participants is to take a look at resilience through death to living or through suicide to living, and to see where the various kinds of resilience issues are, and especially to look at what David is going to introduce or talk about in terms of the 4 things having to do with shame, guilt, and blame and fear. So that's just a quick, and we're going to use some of the geometric thinking models, the tetrahedron in particular, and we'll go from there and turn it over to David.
Maybe what I can do before David starts is just do a little introduction on who David is. So David Bloom is an environmental and social activist since 1989. Bloom continues to stand with marginalized people everywhere and with Indigenous American nations, their allies and accomplices against the oil and gas industry and their enablers. The banksters, fraudsters, and profiteers that continue to break treaties, the same treaties the ancestors were often forced to sign at gunpoint or with the threat of their own and their people's deaths. Bloom worked in commercial equipment leasing and venture capital financing as a broker from 1990 to 2001, specializing in the resource reclamation, used equipment, and natural foods industries. Then returned to college for a Master's of Science in acupuncture and Oriental medicine, learning craniosacral therapy and receiving his massage therapy licensure, with training and extensive clinical practice in the above, plus motivational interviewing and addiction treatment. Welcome to the stage, David.
Thanks, Richard. My back-end management of this was a bit out of integrity, and I apologize for that, but I would like to share the slides that I have. Here we go. So this is the official title, and it went through some evolutions as Richard and I spoke in the weeks before this. And I really like to acknowledge Richard. He clearly has the experience, education, and practice knowledge as a publisher professor and consultant with governments, militaries, public and private organizations throughout the world. It's really an honor to be here today with you, Richard. You might have noticed that his bio was significantly shorter than mine. I really wanted to include that about our indigenous roots on all of these continents. Seems very relevant to previous presentations today, and it's underlying and beaming in pretty much everything we do everywhere we are on this beautiful planet. Richard is clearly more credentialed than I, and my bio is significantly longer. It was my idea to point that out. Richard did approve this message and the biographical differential in advance. Richard and I could sit up here and talk to you about our experience and our expertise for the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes, but that's not why we're here. Here's not so much of a news flash. Our global government, military, news media, business, industry, financial and economic leaders, and their enabling individuals and organizations, mentioned by our illustrious MC, Stephen Bao. Those organizations and individuals, including some, possibly many educational institutions, continually attempt to separate us into essentially powerless individuals and segments, intentional fragments, if you will, with varying levels of purchasing power. Richard and I, plus many millions of others, including many in this room, are here today with a deep passion and commitment for co-supporting, co-maintaining, and co-creating a world that works for all of life. We are even rather confident that that number is now in the billions, which means critical, non-violent mass has been achieved. Simply, it has not been fully integrated. That's what we're up to in the design science decade. And that is going to take all of us together. That includes everybody in this audience, if you're willing to participate, and we hope that you do. I invite you to please feel free to listen, engage, inquire within and without, participate in chat and by audio, if you will, and join us on this 40-minute journey. Yeehaw! Together we shall overcome. That is Lashutsi, the Southern Coast Salish dialect. At this point, I'd like to invite the audience, wherever you're from, to please come off mute and use the word that you know that best signifies together we overcome, or put it in chat if that calls to you.
Dalna Bemak.
Any other guests?
Persistence.
Thank you for sharing, Moni. I see that in chat. I won't try to pronounce it. If anybody else would like to.
It's tenacity. Triunfaremos. That means together we will be triumphant.
One more time, please.
Juntos triunfaremos, which means together we will be triumphant.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeet. See in chat. If any of our guests don't know how to use chat today, if you tap on your screen, the bottom menu should come up. It could be right in the center. It just says chat. It should pop up on the right side. It may be under the 3 dots that say more as well. So feel free to go there if you'd like to stay tuned into chat as well. A few more seconds. Any other guests would like to share the word "we shall overcome" in your language or the of one that you admire?
How about Liebe, which is my tongue's word for love? And you know how Bob said, Mr. Marley said, overcome the devil with a thing called love. That's, you know,
Beautiful. Thank you. Richard, you're welcome to take it from here, segue us into safe space.
Well, just to comment a little bit on love. Every time I hear the concept of love and the word love and the letters of love, I will reconfigure them into a tetrahedral shape because of the fourness of them. And then we can look at the powerful meanings between the L and the O and the O and the V and the E and the L. And we begin to really see the comprehensiveness of a concept like love. One of the things that we kind of want to talk about in terms of third space, the third space, from my work in suicide prevention, was one that emerged over time from the concept of suicide or death and living. And in the work that we've done in suicide safer living, you're always positioning the binary of death to life and talking about how it has to walk through a dilemma. And a dilemma is often, or ambivalence, is often treated negatively. It's a bad place to be. Get off the fence, you can't stay, you got to go one side or the other. We emerged with the notion of a third choice, and a third choice is a safe place to go to, a safe place in your own mind or with the support of others or both, to mull over the binary choices of whether I want to go to one direction or another. And what's really interesting is that the third choice also sets up a triangle between the binary of life and death and the third choice. And when you do that, a triangle has formed a stable structure, and it gives you a place or a safety in order to mull over some of these challenges that we have in our lives and to see how resilience, if you want, can grow out of that third choice in one direction or the other. And when you reflect on Bucky Fuller, and those who know the story of Fuller on the verge of suicide in 1927, he in effect said to himself just before he was to swim out into Lake Michigan and let himself go and suicide that way, he asked if he could, any last words, and he said to himself, and they better be good because they're going to be your last. And in that moment, that what's been described as an epiphany, he sort of said, wait a minute, I don't belong to me, I belong to universe. And I need to do something vis-a-vis universe. And that's when he went into his period of silence and eventually came out with the notion of guinea pig bee, his experiment to see what one little person could do on the bigger scale in life. So that's what the third choice is about. It's about ambivalence, but only it's about the positive side of ambivalence, not the negative side. It's a safe place to be. So that's just a concept of safe space. It applies to us on this kind of discussion as well as in our personal lives or in our helping lives if we're in that kind of discipline. Back to you, David. And while we're looking at that, one of the things that's very common in something like suicide prevention is for you to be aware of warning signs. And we often talk about warning signs. And we're going to be a little cautious here and get you to think about, well, what does warning mean? Yeah, okay. Let's pick up on the agreement and then we'll come back to the warning signs. Way to go, Dave. Yeah.
Richard, thank you. And I didn't mean to interrupt. I meant that to float along with your words, and this is perfect. So, Richard, would you care to read that? Sure.
Well, just in general, it really means that these are safe places for us to have whatever kind of conversation that we want, to share whatever attitudes we have about the concepts that are the focus in terms of fear and guilt and shame. And so we just hope that all of us can respect that agreement and we will work with it. To respect who we are in terms of our ideas and not to be into minimizing or blaming or criticizing, but being open to the dialogue. For me, opening to a dialogue is to be in the spirit of David Bohm and his concept of dialogue as a process that we go through with no intended outcome at the end of it. The outcome will come out of the dialogue. It's not something that's predetermined. So we hope that that's the spirit of this 40 minutes with us. And it's also keeping in the spirit of Bucky Fuller and what was important to him in terms of dare to be naive, dare to be open, dare to be willing to share in a safe space.
I'd say dare to collaborate as well. And that's, I think he brought a lot of people together and landed us all here ultimately, which is a beautiful.
So important, as you say, the dare to collaborate. And I think one of the exciting things about a word like collaborate and cooperate and coordinate has to do with the prefix co. And for those of us that have worked with the concept of trim tab, I've been thinking in the last number of years that the prefix co is one of the most powerful trim tabs that we have available to us and to work with. Is we can turn living in this respect and all of our relations into all kinds of different co's. Co-creation, co-existence, co-determination, collaborate. So just think about it in your own minds, how powerful you think that the little prefix co can be in making the transformations that we all want to make through the design science labs and the art and science of putting art and science together.
Thank you, Richard. I would invite any guests that have any questions about this slide and the fact that this is a safe space today for everybody to share. Is it being live streamed, however? I didn't think about that. Is this being live streamed on? Okay, I'm going.
I believe we did turn the live stream back on.
Okay, I think the important thing at this point is to share this next slide. And that's coming up here. Please take a minute with that. I will read it out loud. For anybody that may be vision impaired. Please note that this is intended to be a panel discussion and conversation with participants about blame, shame, fear, and guilt, and how they can be either empowering and inspiring or absolutely debilitating. If we or those we love do not seek professional support and develop skills to overcome them, please consult a doctor or licensed therapist if you are experiencing deep sensations of fear, shame, or guilt. Richard, would you like to go into a bit of the etiology at this point?
Well, what I was starting to say a little bit earlier, that sometimes I just want to talk about some of the words or the language that's often used in the subject area of suicide prevention, but it also can be the language of suicide safer living, going from prevention of death to promotion of life. But very common in this field is the notion of warning signs. And warning signs are meant to be words that trigger the notion of an early awareness to something that can be prevented. And so you can see how it can be used in something like suicide prevention. But we also know other meanings of warning. Warning often refers to something that's dangerous, something to turn away from, something to avoid. And because suicide is a stigmatized sort of subject, many people take on the notion of warning as a internal sort of sense of, I got to get away, I have to turn away, I don't know how to help, I have to pass it on to an expert. And so we've changed our language, and it'd be interesting to know what you people, all of us as participants, think about changing warning signs to the concept of invitations. So when somebody is giving the sign, they're actually inviting you to get involved. They're inviting you to give them an RSVP. So it doesn't mean go away from, it means come towards. So just for you first to think about whether or not there's power in changing the language of something like warning about life into an invitation to work together.
Richard, maybe this is a good opportunity to try some role playing in that. As somebody that has suffered some pretty great depression and suicidal thinking, it's never gone fully to ideation, other than, hey, I might drive into that tree right there, but I've never stopped, backed up, and run into that tree. I am confident that I'm past those places in my life. And I'm willing to go do some role playing too, if you'd like.
Well, I think before we do the role playing, I think what would be interesting is to connect to it in the same sort of way that I think you're getting at. But let's use the four terms, the four issues that are the topic. And so, and because we're just coming off of an artistic sort of session and some drawing, we can invite participants to try out their drawing skills in another kind of way. But if you in your minds or on a piece of paper can draw what is a tetrahedron to you, and you saw a little image of it, but to put 4 dots in an arrangement so that you can then connect them all, and you'll end up with 6 connecting lines. And if you can put on each corner then one of those words, fear, guilt, shame, and then beside that, if you can just list them in the normal way of 1, 2, 3, 4, put the 4 concepts there. And what we want to do is to see whether or not in your minds there's a difference between looking at these concepts and their interconnections and talking about it in that way, or just looking them at the linear list that we're so familiar with, that only speaks to the entities, it doesn't really show the interconnections. So if you can just draw that, and then I'm going to invite you to try something out, and then we're going to invite you through the chat or to signal you've got a comment you'd like to make or a question you'd like to make online. And as you're doing this, one of the things about using the tetrahedron in this way, we're also using the principles of tensegrity, which means that we're putting compression elements together with relationship or tension elements, and we begin to see the dynamics of how the two work together against just having a list of entities, or as Bucky Fuller would have said, energy events. And
those are the 4 pieces that define integrity, tensegrity. Is that correct, Richard? That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, tensegrity is it's a made-up word, putting the word of tension and integrity together to get tensegrity. And what it really means in Bucky's ideas is that it's the tension or the relationship between things that either holds it together or separates it. So in the concept of resilience, that's what it's really getting at. The resilience is in the tension between, not in the events or the nodes themselves. So in our discussion today, the resilience that one may want to come out of through one of these negative experiences is not in getting rid of the blame or the shame or those concepts. It's on working with the connections between them and the connections to other concepts. So for example, if you've drawn these pictures, on the list side, I would ask you either a question or invite you to say something, and that would be along the line of, tell me what guilt means. Tell me how you feel about guilt. So, and then I would say the same thing about shame or fear. And you can even have a visceral sort of feeling right now in terms of what would be like if David or I were to say to you, tell me about your feelings about guilt. Tell me about guilt in your life. Tell me about shame in your life. Tell me about fear. And just feel the impact of that kind of question and how you would like to or feel like answering. Then I'm going to go.
If I may interject just briefly, Richard, I think you and I talked about this in conversations. This can occur in casual conversation between friends and loved ones. It can be, I mean, I literally have a list of questions I used to ask the kids at dinner. What one thing that made them happy today, one thing that made them sad down the list. And I have also seen through dialoguing with you, exploring your website and other things that, you know, it can be a casual conversation if when it gets to that point that you do understand that a friend or loved one is in a space, a concerning space,
Yeah.
and they're not getting help.
Well, and this is kind of what we're doing with the exercise too, is to say, just to get a feel of the kind of question or the comment that one can make either the dinner table or in another context. And so with the little model that you've drawn, now the question or the request of you would be to say, tell me something about the connection or the relationship between shame and guilt in your life, or fear and guilt. I want to know what's going on between, say, those two concepts. And we could go all the way around. We could end up with the six. But so there's a difference between asking you, tell me something about what it's like to experience the relationship between shame and guilt, or shame and fear, as opposed to me just asking you, tell me about your guilt or your shame. We'll pause on that for a moment. And just, has there been any kind of reaction as to whether there's a variance or difference in terms of asking through the thing, or asking through the relationships between two or more things, to feel comfort enough to comment or answer whatever the question might be?
Richard, I put up the tetrahedron for any new guests that have come into the room since you started. I feel like they're still able to step in and
yeah, they could draw that, and at the end of each of the points there, they can put down the four terms that we're talking about: the compassion, fear, guilt, shame, and what's the other one? Blame. Yeah. Just put them on each corner. And then the lines between them are the connections or the relationships. Sometimes we would make a wireframe model of this. So you take the solid space out of the faces and you would just see the wireframe of, just like in the background of David's screen, you see the wireframe and versus the solid frame, if I can put it that way. So any thoughts in terms of the impact of asking questions in two slightly different ways, either off the list only, or the connections between the items on the list?
Feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat if you have any thoughts that you want to share out loud. Or you can take this as a meditation and think about this internally. This might be a difficult thing to speak about in group.
My tetrahedron has magically disappeared. I'm willing, and if anybody else is willing, let's just take maybe a minute for people to fill that out, finish filling that out.
Yeah, it's like, what's the feeling? What's it like to, what's the impact of being asked about a thing only, and or being asked about the relationship between two or more things? And the focus is on the event for one way, and the focus is on the tension or the relationship between the other way.
I guess I'm looking at guilt and fear in particular, Richard. And if anybody wants to jump in at any point, feel free to. I really feel this can be a free flow kind of discussion and engagement with the audience. And if that doesn't happen, that is perfectly fine. But yeah, I'm looking at the connection between guilt and fear, Richard, and I've had some insights in that through my own struggles. Would you like me to?
Sure, start on that in terms of what's the connection or the relationship between guilt and fear for you?
For me, I look at fear. There's inauthentic fear and authentic fear. Authentic fear being fear that truly is a threat to your life, of course. And we live in a world with a whole lot of inauthentic fear, ranging from marketing and propaganda that tells us we're not enough unless we have X, Y, and Z, to not having, I mean, cars are a piece of that as well. If we don't have a bright, shiny car, people look down on us in this broken paradigm in many ways. At some level, the fear of that not living up to society's standards, for instance, or in some cases, your parents, your families, your peers, that can lead to feelings of guilt. And then for me, guilt descended to shame over many years, probably 20 years.
Yeah,
but if you want to stay just between guilt and fear, we can do that.
No, well, I think what you are sharing, which comes back to the tetrahedron side of things, is as we talk about the relationship between two things, and what that means to us in terms of the connection between fear and guilt, then it opens the door for us to see the connection to another element. In this case, you've talked about shame. So now we begin to see two relationships that are playing between the three items now of guilt and shame or fear and shame. And you can see how that might also lead maybe to the connection with blame. And eventually we'll get a full picture of how those four kind of interrelate with each other. And if there's different ways we can do this too, in terms of trying to get a feel for whether you would like to kind of deal with things in a listed kind of way, a linear type of way, or whether it feels more resilient if you want to do it in a tetrahedral way, where you put them in a way in which the connections in between all of them can be looked at, and then we can then talk about the relationship between blame and say fear, or we can also talk about each one of them independently. Well, they're not independent, but we can talk about them in a focused way. So I can say, I can go deeper into what fear means to me, or I can go deeper into what shame, and then I can talk about, does that change the way in which they relate with each other? So we're always talking about the connection between and the thing itself, much more dynamic than just talking about the thing itself.
Absolutely. Say, Richard, we have about 4 to 5 minutes left. I thought maybe we could wrap up by covering the what not to do's. we've had conversations about that, the minimizing, avoiding, and I have a slide for that I can put up briefly. I believe this is so in depth, it's not something you can cover in 45 minutes. And I believe, Richard, thank you so much for participating on this panel with me. I will put up that slide. The 4 things we did talk about in particular, and I know there's more than this as well. And are you seeing that yourself, Richard?
Yes, yeah.
Good, good.
Yeah, and this is a typical sort of list that one gets. And I'll relate to it in our suicide prevention or suicide safer living work. Very often in a article or a promotion brochure, you will get a list of things to do and not to do. It's sort of like the job jar at home of what I have to do today, what I'm not supposed to do. And so that's important. And in this, what we are getting at today is not to minimize anyone's issues or concerns, not to patronize, not to dismiss, and not to avoid. But in the same way, if we could reconfigure them in the tetrahedral shape as well, then we begin to see the connection between minimizing and patronizing, or patronizing and avoiding, and we get a better feel, from my perspective, I may be wrong on this, but we get a better feel for why we would give somebody a list like this of the not to-dos. And the not to-dos are often in that paternalistic kind of fashion that what you were saying at the very beginning of our sessions, where somebody tries to order the way in which you're supposed to do your living. And same way with things not to do. That's it conveys the same kind of message. But if you can see the interconnection and talk them through, then the reason why lists are made the way they are can make sense, or we can find the flaws in the list and correct them, change them, modify them. So we're all given voice. I think our concern about the resilience issue, the regeneration issue, is that all the parties at the table are not given voice. And that can be you and me as a person, or I was working with planetary care people, and we realized that the other things have not been given voice. Soil doesn't get a voice, water doesn't get a voice. All of these other important things we can give voice to and listen in a deeper way than we probably have through our Newtonian reductionist mechanistic sort of worldviews.
If I may, real quick, I think I can just wrap this up. I believe Richard's interest in this and my interest in it, and anybody that's in here, hopefully, is that we love people, not just those that we know. And the future that we talk about creating, we can have right now if we start taking care with some of these things, creating a paradigm shift from suicide prevention to suicide safe. It is endemic in our societies across the world. And the more we can learn, the more we can help others, the better, because we need everybody in the world right now, because together we already have those tools that Bucky said we would have 50 years ago to create this paradigm. That's all I wanted to contribute.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, Richard and David, for walking us through these different ways of thinking about guilt and shame and blame and fear. And I was inspired to think about this in terms of the model that I've been working on, where fear is at the center where we have this perception of fear, and then it sort of moves into these different ways of how we process them, through the cognition, through emotion, and then action. There's different ways that this emotion or this sense of fear that gets manifested in our human experience. So if anyone feels like that sort of fits a model of their experience, I'd be interesting to hear. But I'd love to now, I'm not sure if I'm introducing, or Alicia, do you want to introduce Margie?
Sure.
Marlowe?
I want to, yeah, I'd love to. I just wanted to also echo some gratitude for Richard and Oaken. And I feel like the conversation about guilt and shame and fear, there's a lot of grief in that. And what I've come to understand from the teachings of Martine Prechtel is grief's sister is praise. It's praise for life and our loved ones and those that we may no longer have experience a physical connection with anymore. But I think that then that ties into what you were saying, Oaken, about the fact is that we really just love people, and so tied up in all of that grief and the shame, guilt, is ultimately our longing for loving others and to feel that sense of love and the praise for life that exists within that, So these are deep wounds that are being tended to. And I think that our next speaker, Margie, she also does a really beautiful job of speaking about this and within consent. And I love the video that we play of hers every day about that. And Margie is a deep believer in community care, interdependence, and connection.
Alicia here. Before you,
sorry?
Margie, before you finish entering Margie, I
Yes.
want to close and reopen the stream. So find a natural pause. I'll stop it and then we can restart it.
Well, thank you all for joining us here today with Richard and David and Stephen and myself, and with resilience and coming together and all of these beautiful conversations that are taking place here. We will see you again here in a few moments.